Hello, I'm Ben Wattenberg. We have an easy topic today. Why is there something instead of nothing? Does the universe have a purpose? Well, scientists look to equations and quarks, while theologians talk of a divine force behind it all. This week, we look at the very big picture and ask, is there a collision between science and religion? Joining us to sort through the conflict and consensus are astrophysicist Robert Jastrow, director of the Mount Wilson Observatory, president of the George Marshall Institute, and author of God and the Astronomers; Robert Park, professor of physics at the University of Maryland; Margaret Wertheim, author of Pythagoras' Trousers, God, Physics, and the Gender Wars; and John Haught, professor of theology at Georgetown University and author of the forthcoming book, Science and Religion, From Conflict to Conversation. The topic before this House: does science leave room for religion, and vice versa? This week on Think Tank. In 1633, Galileo was forced by the Roman Catholic Church to say that he abjured, cursed, and detested his own scientifically proven view that the Earth was not the center of the universe. The tension between religion and science hasn't gone away. Just consider the ongoing fight over the theory of evolution versus the theory of creationism. In the modern world, science is a vastly successful enterprise. Astronomers can explain how the planets move around the sun. Astrophysicists discuss what happened during the first seconds of the Big Bang when the universe began. Biologists are spelling out the genetic recipe for human beings, and doctors regularly perform real miracles to cure the sick. Religion continues to play an important role in the lives of most Americans. Religion offers answers to questions that science cannot deal with. Why are we here? What is the purpose of the universe? And how should we act? Now, as modern science advances, do God and religion retreat to the remaining gaps in our knowledge of the universe? And conversely, while science can tell us how to do something, it can't tell us when we ought to do something, and some critics say that it can erode that moral sense. Okay, gentlemen, lady, let us begin with a simple question, of course, that we might just go quickly around the room with, starting with you, Bob Jastrow. Just what is the nature of the tension between science and religion?
It's based on a misunderstanding of the function and the nature of both. There should be no tension and need not be any, because they deal with completely non-overlapping spheres of human thought.
Okay. Bob Park.
The problem usually arises when religion gives a special place to man in the universe. And it's that specialness that was, of course, the problem in the Copernican theory that the Earth is not the center of the universe. It's the problem in evolution. And science doesn't recognize that specialness.
Okay. John Haught.
Well, like Robert, I see no inherent conflict.
There are two Roberts.
Robert Jastrow.
Robert Jastrow.
I see no inherent conflict between science and religion as such. The nature of the conflict, I think, is fundamentally a conflict between two kinds of beliefs. The conflict between scientism, which is the view that science is the only road to truth, and certain understandings of religion tend to clash. But I see no inherent conflict between science and religion as such.
Margaret Wertheim.
Yes, I agree with that. I think that there is no inherent conflict between science and religion. I think it's largely one of perception, that when we have too narrow views of what constitutes religion or too narrow views of what constitutes science, then tensions arise, but it's not because there's an intrinsic conflict there.
Well, over the centuries, hasn't science undercut certain religious beliefs? I mean, some of the miracles described in the Bible, for example.
Oh, absolutely. And in each case, eventually, religion has had to retreat from those positions.
For example?
Evolution is certainly one of those. The heliocentric solar system is another. But Yeah, and
Heliocentric meaning?
the sun is at the center of
Okay,
the...
you'll excuse my ignorance, right.
The two spheres of thought should and really do deal with separate realms of inquiry, because science is concerned with trying to explain to us with predictive power what the reason is for what we see around us, but religion is concerned with the purpose, whether there's a larger design in all of this. Is there a purpose in the seeming emergence of mankind out of a sea of primordial molecules, for example? What does that mean in the larger sense? That's not a scientific question.
But I also think there's an issue that the very fact that scientists are on the one hand now saying that religion is the enemy, but on the other hand more and more scientists are talking about God in their own work. And so I think what we have here is a situation where in effect scientists are wanting to set themselves up as the new theologians. In a sense, what they are trying to do is to not just claim nature, but more and more they are trying to take over the position that has traditionally been regarded as the theological position. You have physicists now claiming that they think they can explain why the universe came into being. So I think that in some ways what you've got going here is just a power struggle. Scientists want to claim more and more of the world for themselves and have less and less the provenance of other domains of knowledge.
I think it's very important to recognize that point. That is, when a scientist says that he knows through his work that there is no purpose in the universe and denies the existence of a larger force, he's making an expression of a personal faith as arrogant, or in any case as religious in its own right, as that of a theologian.
But the scientist does work on the assumption that the universe is governed by a set of natural laws and that there's no way to circumvent those laws. So one thing that we're dealing here with is many people's perception of a religion is a God that intervenes on their behalf, or if you make the right supplications to him, and that violates the basic assumption of science that things are going to proceed according to natural law.
If science is what rules our destiny, what does it say about a moral code as to how people ought to live, or is that, are you prepared to turn that over to somebody else because all you know is molecules?
There were moral codes throughout history, and many of them have been tied to religion. But religion is not the only way to arrive at some ethical code. If you want to establish that ethical code and call it a religion, that's fine too. When scientists refer to God, very often they're using it in a sort of metaphorical sense for the laws of nature.
Is that what is called by cosmologists the theory of everything, or the God particle? Is that what?
That is what is very commonly associated with God. And when Stephen Hawking in his book referred to knowing the mind of God, he was talking about when we understand this theory of everything, which would show how the universe was united in a single set of equations. And one of the things about this endeavor, which is why it can be associated with God, is that this set of equations is supposed to sort of transcend space and time, that it has this existence completely outside of the physical universe. Now, traditionally, the only thing that has had that sort of a status has been God. So there has always been this tendency to associate the mathematical laws that we discover in the world with God. That's a historical thing, that physics really did emerge from a religious tradition. And the fact that you have physicists talking about the mind of God today is part of a long-standing part of our history. So I think that it's an important thing to understand that physics and religion have actually had a long and fruitful relationship with one another.
Ben, I think there's some confusion, not in your comments, but in the general the structure of the discussion, because I don't think any of my colleagues in cosmology would assert that they understand what forces conspired in some sense to create that thing we call the Big Bang. The origin of the universe is not an explainable in itself discovery. What happened thereafter is quite explainable. In the same sense, leaving the world of inanimate matter and looking at the world of life, I find Darwin's concepts of natural selection to be very satisfactory, and so do many other people, in explaining the emergence of more and more complex creatures out of simple beginnings. When you look at this in detail, all is randomness, as Bob Park said a little while ago. When you step back and look at the whole picture, you see a direction and a flow from simple to complex, from less intelligent to more intelligent, and you ask yourself, can this, which has a direction, yet be completely undirected? And it's at that point that science reaches the natural limits of its inquiry, and one's thoughts about the world in the religious realm enter. But there is no overlap between them. No sense of design or purpose can be extracted from the scientific story.
Bob Parks, when you and your colleagues in the world of physics march ever backwards toward the beginning of the universe, do you think you are going at some point in this generation or in generations to come that somebody is going to come upon the unmoved mover?
I suspect not. In Stephen Hawking's book, he refers to an audience he had with the Pope, and the Pope commented at that time that it was all right to study everything right back to the Big Bang, but at that point that became the domain of religion. The science doesn't allow for that sort of thing. It's going to proceed wherever it wants, and it's not good. The Pope notwithstanding, science is going to look into those questions. I do not think they're going to find the creator when they get there.
I think theologians would be very cautious about saying that science and religion come together at t equals 0. So I would agree very much with Bob, because because in the past science has been, or theology has been burned considerably by too cozy a relationship with physics. There's a saying that the theology that marries the physics of one age will become a widow in the next. And I think today many theologians want to avoid what happened after Isaac Newton, when theologians thought that Newtonian physics had provided a firm foundation for theology for one generation. The next generation says, no, we don't need that relationship at all. And so theology became somewhat stranded in the modern university because of that big mistake that was made at that time.
What do you make of the tens of millions of Americans who are born-again Christians, who say they have had a revealing experience, and they will so testify, describe it, believe in it, and it shapes their lives? This seems to be extra scientific. It's out of your world.
I would say so, yes. In fact, it struck me as we were talking here that the religion we're talking about is the religions of the theologians, and not the religion of the mass of the American people who believe that God intervenes in their lives. And you won't find many physicists that will agree with that.
Well, I think
there are no born-again physicists by definition?
No, certainly there are anything physicists. I mean, a PhD in physics is not an inoculation against foolishness.
You would say that a devout believer of a God in history is just barking up the wrong tree. Basically, that's where you come out.
I think probably that's right, yeah.
That's an assertion that you can neither prove nor disprove.
I completely agree with that.
And it comes back very close to the question, is there a design or a larger purpose or force in the universe that you can't discern in the laws of contemporary physics? Anyone who makes a statement, either on either side of that issue, is making a statement of religious faith and has crossed the boundary from science into theology.
What is, I don't mean to be personal, but what is your answer to the religious question? Are you...
I'm a committed reductionist. I think that the whole is equal to the sum of the parts, but I also know that there is no way within my scientific discipline of finding out whether there is a larger purpose or design in the universe. So I remain an agnostic and not an atheist. To profess disbelief in the existence of design or of the deity is essentially in itself a theological statement, which a scientist cannot make on the structure, on the strength of his own discipline. He can only
Margaret,
make it as a
are you
belief.
an agnostic?
I wouldn't put it quite that way. I certainly don't believe in the Judeo-Christian God. I think that I am what could be called a Neoplatonist. I believe the nature is governed by laws, but I also think that there is some sort of fundamental immaterial soul of the universe.
So you do
that
believe in
underlies
a larger design or purpose or force?
Yes.
So you,
yes, but
yes.
I don't believe that there is some sort of consciousness up there directing things, but I do not believe in the purely
Now I'm
materialist
confused.
notion.
If you don't think there's something conscious directing things, then what do you mean by the existence of the soul that transcends physical
I
existence?
don't believe in a soul that transcends. I believe in a soul. The Platonist position is essentially a soul that is immanent within the world, so that I believe that there is, if you like, some force of goodness that pervades the universe and that in some sense allows us that gives it its intelligibility, that allows us as conscious beings to connect with the intelligibility of the
this
world.
force of goodness cannot be discerned in physical law, as Bob Parker.
No, I agree with that. It cannot be discerned in physical law. I think the big issue.
So you are not an agnostic, really.
No, no. That's what I'm saying. I'm not an agnostic.
Yes.
I mean, I think that the big question facing the science-religion dialogue now.
And you're not an atheist.
And no, I'm not an atheist. No.
Would you be a deist?
Doesn't have to be a God that intervenes in
Yes.
personal affairs. It can be very amorphous.
Let me ask this question.
Well-
I'm standing here and I'm thinking that I had this discussion about 40 years ago as a sophomore over a pitcher of beer. Now, most of you from the world of high physics and high science. What have you or science learned in these last 40 years that doesn't come up in a normal bull session about this topic?
The beauty of the universe is something that you get from physics
The time. That is being constantly revealed.
Yes.
That we didn't understand 40 years ago.
Yes, the extraordinary beauty of creation is.
For example.
Well, general relativity, I think, is truly one of the aesthetic high points of Western culture. I think it rates alongside the works of Michelangelo and Leonardo as a truly great.
Can you describe general relativity for our audience?
Well, general relativity is the theory which tries to, it emerged from trying to explain gravity, and it ultimately became the theory that shows us the shape and structure of space-time. So general relativity shows us that the whole of the cosmos, rather than just being this sort of infinite nothingness, actually has an architecture. To me, that is just one of the most beautiful ideas I've ever encountered.
Ben, 40 years ago was an interesting time point. Because 40 years ago, we did not have proof in cosmology that the universe began in a certain instant of time as a result of forces you cannot describe at the present time.
This is the Big Bang.
Yes, that proof came a little later, yes. About 30 years ago. And 40 years ago, well, we did have the body of thought that Darwin bequeathed to his successors. I was not acquainted with it at that time. So we could explain the emergence of advanced forms of life out of simpler forms. And so I would say that it's 50-50 with regard to your time point. Half of this could have been held 40 years ago and half could not have been.
Ben?
But I quite agree, and I think Margaret's point was just right, that we do now know things we didn't know then. So for those who like for religion to fill in the gaps, there are fewer gaps than there were to fill in.
May I take issue with that in the friendliest fashion? I think that what we've learned from the study of the fossil record and our researchers in biochemistry is that over the course of about 4 billion years, by a succession of very small steps, that individual entity we call Homo sapiens has emerged out of a primordial soup of molecules. It's an extraordinary fact if true. And if it happened without direction, without design, that makes it even more extraordinary. And the key issue, it seems to me, is did in fact the essence of spirituality, morality, and thought on this planet emerge without direction by a succession of random events governed only by natural selection? It seems to me that's the key question.
John?
Well, I want to come back to the question of what we've learned from science. Science has been a great gift, recent science in particular, because in modern times the main source of protest against religion by scientific skeptics has been based on a very materialist, brickyard type of materialist view of the cosmos. And there have been a number of developments in recent science, relativity, quantum physics, chaos theory, and so forth, which are in themselves scientific refutations of the old kind of materialism, which was the intellectual basis of so much post-Enlightenment skepticism. So that breaking down of that materialist view is at least indirectly consequential to theology.
Bob Jastrow, you have written, and I have heard you speak to the question that the Earth is the only planet where human existence is possible or plausible.
I've raised that question, as many others have. I don't think it's so, but that's an expression of faith. These are all religious thoughts.
You do not think what is so?
I do not think it is so that this planet is the only site of chemical evolution and the emergence of intelligent life, because I see nothing exceptional about the chemistry or the physics of our planet's history compared to the trillions of others we know by inference exist around us. But I have no proof that we are not alone. And when I say I think we're not alone, I'm making a religious statement.
That will be another one of those discoveries that diminishes the specialness of man. If we were to somehow pick up signals from another intelligent creature somewhere in the universe, that would be the ultimate
wouldn't that
diminishment
just
of the
expand
specialness.
the nature of the grandeur of the deity, that he can do it twice?
Oh yes, and I would be astonished if they looked anything like us.
Indeed, so would I. There's a problem here, because you must remember that there are something like 10 to the 22 possible or probable systems. What is that? That's not quite a trillion, but it's getting up there. 100 billion trillion systems of planets in the visible universe. And if indeed they are, many of them, even 1 in a billion, are inhabited, there's an enormous multitude of intelligent life for the deity to divide his attention amongst. And it puts the classical ideas of theology in a somewhat different light, and I think it creates philosophical and intellectual problems for theology to think of a deity doing this.
Well, I agree that such a discovery would relativize our importance, but if you look at what religions are fundamentally about, it's essentially decentralizing our egos, so that discovery would not be in consonant with the basic thrust of religion.
What does that mean, decentralizing our egos?
That most of the problems that humans experience, and for example in Buddhism, even suffering, comes from greed and selfishness and egotism. So anything that would somehow decentralize our egotism, such as the discovery of, say, intelligent life elsewhere in the universe, would have that effect. But the discovery of intelligence in the rest of the universe would be quite consonant also with the biblical view of a God of extravagant creativity as well. And that's something.
But how does he find the time and energy to, even God, to devote himself to these trillions of planets?
Well, I think fundamental to religion is that God's ways are not our ways.
All right, let us, just for the sake of sanity here, very quickly go around the room, starting with you, Margaret, and try to tell me and our audience what it is that scientists generally, that this panel, what do you agree about and what do you disagree about?
Well, I think the fight has really been about how far can science go? How far can it extend its domain of questioning and authority? And I think that Bob Park suggests it can extend the domain of authority and knowledge far greater than I believe that it can. And I think that is the central issue. How much territory should science be allowed to have?
And you have some limits on that.
I think I think that there are limits on what science can do.
John Haught.
I would completely agree because I think one of the things that science will never be able to show is that science is the most appropriate road to truth. To attempt to do so would be logically circular.
Bob Park.
I believe it is the ultimate road to truth, that it is the only way we have of sorting out ideology and foolishness from the truth. We just don't have any other way.
But science has made some monumentally foolish mistakes in its
and it will continue to. But it finds the mistakes and it corrects them.
Well, except by definition, the ones that it hasn't found.
That's right.
Bob Jastrow.
It seems to me that underlying this discussion has been the key issue whether there is an overlap between the domains of science and theology. And my colleagues and I differ in some degree on that. I believe there is no overlap, and these are dichotomous, completely different domains of thought.
Okay, thank you, Robert Jastrow, Margaret Wertheim, Robert Park, and John Haught. And thank you.
We at Think Tank depend on your views to make our show better. Please send your questions and comments to New River Media, 1150 17th Street Northwest, Washington, D.C. 20036. Or email us at thinktank@pbs.org. To learn more about Think Tank, visit PBS online at www.pbs.org. And please let us know where you watch Think Tank.
For Think Tank, I'm Ben Wattenberg.
This has been a production of BJW Incorporated in association with New River Media, which are solely responsible for its content.